This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we are counting on you. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation focused on democracy, populism, authoritarianism, and all of its causes, symptoms, and manifestations.
And today's conversation takes us back to the United States for a look at the long historic basis for America's current right-wing politics. To that end, we're very pleased to welcome Nancy MacLean, who is the William Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. She's speaking to us today from Durham, North Carolina. Her research focuses on race, gender, labor history, and social movements in the 20th century in the U.S., with particular attention to the U.S. South. She's also the author of 4 books, in addition to the one we'll be discussing today, called Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, published by Viking in 2017. Nancy MacLean, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
There has been a flood of writing, lots of ink spilled, trying to figure out how America got into its current phase of right-wing populism, at least prior to the last election. And some analyses like to go a few years back, but you have looked at the roots of the radical right today many decades back, even centuries. And I wanted to ask you, what have you found in these further reaching historic political trends that has been missing up until now from our understanding of today's right-wing politics in the U.S.?
Yes. Well, in a nutshell, I'd say that what I found was the set of ideas that has been weaponized and turned into a strategy to make libertarian political economy possible in America. And these ideas have been taken up by Charles Koch, one of the wealthiest people in the world, and a figure on the extreme libertarian right in the U.S. who has convened a donor network of over 600 like-minded donors who give a minimum of $100,000 a year. So they have been investing to transform not only our politics, but our society, our institutions, higher education, the whole works. And I happened onto this story the only way I think it could be done, which was by serendipity, picking up a thread in the late 1950s in the U.S. South of the source of these ideas that the Koch network has turned into a strategy to radically transform our country by stealth without informing the people of its true objectives. So we can pick that Shaggy Dog story up anywhere you'd like.
Oh, we'll pick it up right now. Can you tell us about the character at the center of your book, James McGill Buchanan, whom you view as the ideological forefather to Charles Koch and the Koch brothers, I suppose, in general, but also the Tea Party and perhaps even Trumpism today? How do you link them all back to James McGill Buchanan?
Yes. So James McGill Buchanan, I'm sure, is not familiar to most of your listeners. He was not familiar to me when I started this research, but he was the first U.S. Southerner to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. And he won that in the 1980s for work that he had begun in the late 1950s and early 1960s in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia. And I picked up his trail because I was looking at the state of Virginia's reaction to the major Supreme Court desegregation decision in the U.S., Brown versus Board of Education. And the state of Virginia responded to that decision with what was called massive resistance, a policy to defy the U.S. Supreme Court mandate to desegregate public education. And what massive resistance entailed was, first of all, tax subsidized legalized what we would today call vouchers for private segregation academies beyond the reach of the courts. Also, a requirement that local school districts that were planning to desegregate be shut down by the governor to prevent them from doing so, and a whole suite of bills to take away First Amendment rights from the NAACP, the main African American organization behind the desegregation litigation. So it was really quite something. But what struck me as I was doing that research was the intervention of the economics department chairman at the University of Virginia, the newly appointed James McGill Buchanan, and a colleague who made an economic argument for what the most arch segregationists of the day were seeking. And basically, they made the kind of case for school vouchers for private school education that we hear quite regularly now, and that was made also by one of their advisors at the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, who I'm sure will be known to many of your listeners as a leading 20th century neoclassical economist and someone who wrote the book Capitalism and Freedom. So I started pulling at that thread, wondering why these economists would be helping the most arch segregationists of the day. And again, a very shaggy dog story, more than 10 years of research, but that ultimately led me to Charles Koch and the network of organizations he funds. He and James Buchanan got to know each other as early as 1969, if not before. And then James Buchanan was present as Koch began to create an infrastructure of organizations to put these arch libertarian ideas into practice, beginning with the Cato Institute, which was originally called the Charles Koch Foundation in the 1970s, a push to promote Austrian economics that Buchanan was part of. And by today, there are literally hundreds of organizations in the US and several hundred more transnationally as part of something called the Atlas Network that are carrying this extreme libertarian, corporate-funded donor ideology and trying to, in a sense, rig the rules of the political process in state after state in our country, in the U.S., nationally, and internationally. And the way that this connects to right-wing populism, to the Trump victory, et cetera, is that these libertarians realize that the vast majority of the country and the world would never want to live in the world that they are trying to create. And the single most important finding of my book was to see these strategists saying this again and again, recognizing the unpopularity of their ideas, Buchanan first, then later Charles Koch. And so what they have done is to leverage prejudices of all kinds, racism against African Americans, against immigrants, against women, against lesbians and gays, most recently transgender people, leverage those prejudices to get, in our case, Republican voters to the polls to vote for a party that the donor network has managed to take over by changing the incentives to which those elected officials are accountable. And so, again, we could pick this up at any different point.
There's a lot to unpack in
Gilad and I
here.
are like, we're having a big boxing match here to see who gets to ask the next question. So I'm going to introduce Gilad's question by just asking you about other relevant thinkers here. I mean, you mentioned the Atlas Network. Yeah. Could this be in any way related to Ayn Rand? And Gilad will add to the question.
No, I just want to, before we get into the big money and the politics of it, I'd like to stay in the realm of ideas a bit longer and ask you really about Buchanan himself. How influential do you think he was in shaping post-war and maybe 21st century right-wing politics in America? And, as opposed to, say, you mentioned Milton Friedman, I was thinking also reading a book about William F. Buckley Jr., other big names that we've come to realize as almost single-handedly shaping right-wing politics in America. And maybe ask you whether Buchanan, looking at it today, was to Trumpism what Friedman and Buckley were to Reaganism back in the day.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think of Buchanan and Friedman as almost like the yin and the yang of this ultra kind of free market fundamentalist project. And the reason I say that is because Milton Friedman had this very sunny disposition. He was very public about what he believed in. He was always making the case for markets, the case for equating markets. Not regulated by government with freedom, whereas Buchanan was a figure who was much more content to remain in the shadows. He was not visible publicly. He was not a great communicator in the way that Friedman was, and I think in some ways he was actually, this may be not a great adjective, but he was a more sinister figure. And what I mean by that is, whereas Friedman became kind of enraptured through something called the Mont Pelerin Society, which contained thinkers like, Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Friedman became enraptured by the possibility of freed markets. But Buchanan was a very different figure. He had grown up in rural Tennessee in the Great Depression in a farm family, and he understood that you would never win this battle by making a case just for freeing corporations, right? Essentially, is what it's about. You would not make that. You would not succeed making that case because too many people, especially of his generation, the Depression generation, understood that government intervention was absolutely crucial for their well-being. Whether it was, providing rural electrification for places like Tennessee, where he grew up, or providing Social Security and workers' rights, all of these things were tremendously popular. So what Buchanan did that was his kind of particular genius and contribution to this was develop a body of thought called public choice economics more broadly. And his more particular version was the Virginia School of Political Economy. And the goal of this, as he informed his funders and people on the right he was working with, was to actually undermine public trust in government and public confidence that government could do what the people looked to it to do. And that was really an important move because, in the mid 20th century, when he and Friedman and others in the Mont Pelerin Society set to work, most economists were focused on market failure and understanding the ways in which, for example, we could say climate change is a huge market failure, right? Or our troubled healthcare system in the United States, market failure. So people would look to government to remedy those problems. Buchanan saw that, and he wanted to basically make it so that government wouldn't be seen as a plausible alternative to markets, or that it would be subject to such strict scrutiny that in time people would give up on government. And so basically the way that he approached things was to say that public actors of all kinds should be understood in the same way that neoclassical economics understood private market actors. That is, as rational, self-interested individuals who were seeking their own ends. And so it was deliberately a kind of debunking operation from the beginning to say public officials did not care about the things that they said they cared about, whether it was, say, labor union leaders. They didn't really care about workers or, government officials. They didn't really care about retirement security for seniors. What they were doing is just using, and this is an old trope on the right, but other people's money to buy voters or to buy support. So it's a really toxic way of looking at public life and at public officials.
And that leads them to the conclusion that government should be as absolutely limited as possible, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand, I think, and would be shocked if they did understand, is that for these arch libertarians, government has only three legitimate functions. And those are to provide for the national defense, and a fairly restricted view of that, to guarantee the rule of law, and to ensure public order. So Translated simply, that means armies, courts, and police. Nothing else is legitimate.
Sounds cheerful. But I want to jump in and ask you about a side of this that we haven't discussed, but which really is the opening of your book, and it's a theme throughout, which is the racial grounding that is part and parcel of this approach to governance. I mean, you write at one point, the notion of, I'm quoting you, the notion of unwarranted federal intervention has been inseparable from the desire to maintain white racial as well as class dominance. And I want to ask you, is your argument that at the core of Buchanan's ideology was a vision that was ultimately about racial supremacy or subservience, or he was co-opted to serve that cause, or is one of those causes serving the other, or does it even matter? They're simply intertwined, and it doesn't matter which one is dominant.
Yeah, I think your last point is the correct one, that they are so intertwined that it's hard to separate. I was actually very careful in the book not to reduce all of this to racism, because I don't actually think that that's accurate. What I talked about was what I called property supremacy, which in the U.S., given a country whose premier capitalist industry in the 19th century was slavery and production, particularly cotton production through racial slavery. Those things have been imbricated, since forever. And the most extreme defenders of property supremacy in the U.S., going back to a man named John C. Calhoun that I write about, who was a senator from South Carolina, who said on the Senate floor, slavery is a positive good. These folks have had class power and racial privilege woven together so much that, as you say, it's almost pointless to try to separate them. So I don't think that Buchanan was motivated simply by racism in the way that many people understand it, which is almost like racism is an irrational way of understanding the world as a set of personal prejudices or a kind of sin of the heart. But rather, I think that his commitment, and all of these folks' commitment to this arch libertarian view of political economy necessarily leads to, it can only be possible by some degree of assumption of white racial dominance, and it also slides into that. So another way to get at this is to point out that social Darwinism has been central to this libertarian ideology from the get-go. Because how do you explain long-term, multi-generational inequality in a society based on conquest of, in our case, Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans and the perpetuation of that intergenerational inequality? If you say the market is perfectly fine and the market is the domain of freedom, and people are just freely contracting, then you get pulled into racial explanations or cultural explanations for this. And Charles Murray, if you're familiar with him, is very much a part of this libertarian enterprise and has been writing for years things questioning the intelligence of different racial and ethnic groups in the United States. Really, really troubling stuff. And we also have seen over the years a slide from this arch libertarianism into what is now called in the US the alt-right, right? The white nationalist, white supremacist, often anti-Semitic right. And we also see that with Atlas Network affiliates. So there's been some research on this in Germany and Austria. The libertarian groups, like the Hayek Institute, I believe it's called in Germany, many of their members are now working with the Alternative for Deutschland, the German neo-Nazi group. So you see this again and again, and I think it's because social Darwinism is so paired with libertarianism as a way of explaining differences in advantages in particular countries without recourse to history, and explaining inequality.
You're right that the goal of Buchanan's project was ultimately to save capitalism from democracy. And can you unpack this for us and explain where exactly does democracy interfere with capitalism?
Which is funny because I always thought that democracy depends on capitalism fundamentally.
Exactly.
Not
Yes,
that I necessarily support that, but
and Milton Friedman actually, wrote that book, Capitalism and Freedom. But there was always a slide between freedom and democracy. And when you come right down to it, what they're really saying is that economic liberty is most important, not democracy. And so Charles Koch, I quote language from him like that. The big hedge fund billionaire Peter Thiel, who's been associated with both the Koch donor network and is a big supporter of Donald Trump, he has said capitalism is more important than democracy. And you'll find many other people in that tradition who make similar statements. Again, a lot of this is grounded in Buchanan's Virginia School of Political Economy, which argues that the liberal state, as we call it, kind of the modern 20th century forms of government grew up because of essentially democratic pressures. And many of these thinkers, and again, I quote them in the book, but they will say that the threats to economic liberty developed in the 20th century with the mass enfranchisement of working class people. They often point to women's suffrage too, as a culprit in all of this. Peter Thiel has done that, for example, as has another academic who works closely with Charles Koch at George Mason University. But basically, so what they say is that, in a sense, citizen pressure on elected officials has made elected officials respond to that pressure by taxing and spending, right? By taking from, in the libertarians' terms, the makers, the corporate leaders, the wealthy people, to give to the so-called takers. So that is the ideology behind this, or the analysis behind this, and then the idea that the strategies that flow from that are trying to find ways to curb the political participation of people who would want to see active government. So in our country, we see laws against labor unions, what's called right to work here, which is really kind of a fiction. It's anti-union legislation. We saw with Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin. If you all paid any attention to that in 2011, was the first, starting gun of an attack on public sector workers' rights to collectively bargain. From there, we saw the most aggressive and technologically sophisticated gerrymanders in American political history in the states controlled by this radicalized, Tea Party, Koch-funded Republican Party, and of course, voter suppression on a scale that we have not seen since the white supremacist undermined Black voting power in the U.S. at the turn of the 20th century. So all of these things together are trying to, as I say in the book, to shackle the democratic process. And that's actually language, that kind of language of enchaining and shackling is language I got from James Buchanan talking about what was needed. And he said that that kind of shackling should go up to the point of what he himself called constitutional revolution, achieving such significant changes in constitutions that they would prevent that popular will from being able to take effect. And he advised on the Chilean constitution put into practice by the Pinochet military junta, and that has become a model for what this Koch network is trying to get in the U.S. in the way of constitutional change.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you exactly on this. How successful have they been in really implementing those ideas, these efforts, and the huge investment that you're talking about? Is it not more just than just a dent in the illustrious American democracy? It is something that is more nefarious and more long lasting than.
Yes, this is huge now. So, because the effort to change the courts and constitutional interpretation has many prongs. Charles Koch has been funding these efforts and getting like-minded donors to fund efforts to change the courts since the 1970s, with litigation outfits, with a field called law and economics, which has become, a large and almost dominant part of law school training in many places. and also by the Federalist Society, developed in the mid 80s, which has become hugely important as an alternative right-wing credentialing outfit for federal judges and Supreme Court justices. And politicians, presidents from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush to Donald Trump have only essentially been selecting justices from the Federalist Society. So it has reached the point where Sheldon Whitehouse, the U.S. Senator from Rhode Island, who now heads the Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee, has spoken of captured courts and has a project on these captured courts and traces all of this to this Koch network and to the designs that they have had on the courts, the incredibly sophisticated and effective way they have moved into law schools, and they have funded dark money operations to ensure the confirmation of arch-right justices, from John Roberts, the current Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, to Brett Kavanaugh, to Amy Coney Barrett. So we have now a two-thirds majority on the Supreme Court that has come from the Federalist Society, that has this arch-right view of the Constitution, and that has decided cases that have advanced this Koch vision. And
can you give us an example of, maybe some changes on the ground?
So Citizens United was a Supreme Court decision that gained a lot of attention because it essentially opened the spigots to corporate money in politics, claiming that that was free speech and that any restrictions on that money, including dark money, as it has become the untraceable dark money, any restrictions would be free speech violations. So it was with that Citizens United decision that the Koch network was then able to pump tons of money, unheard of amounts of money, into the 2010 midterm elections and gain control of 32 states in which they could then practice the gerrymandering and the voter suppression. That Citizens United case was litigated by outfits funded by this Koch donor network and pursued for years to open up the way to dark money in corporate spending and politics. So that's one example.
Can I propose my own personal name for this whole approach? Reverse Marxism, which basically says, what do you think, right? It works. I mean, in other words, basically saying, yes, we completely admit that everything in government should be controlled by capital, and we plan to advance that agenda because we think it's right, as opposed to Marxism, which would try to expose it in order to undermine it. And the result is the same in a way, in practice, because they're ultimately undermining individual rights in every way, shape, or form. What do you think of my theory?
I think your theory is a good one. And I see it as kind of a slow motion, quiet capitalist revolution. So I like your theory. And I think it's accurate. And I would only add two things. One is this doesn't need to be like a Marxist revolution, of the workers, in this case, the capitalists joining together, because, as the old axiom goes, there's two sources of power in society, ultimately: organized money and organized people. So this Koch donor network understands that they are a tiny minority. And Charles Koch actually said this when he started in earnest in the 1990s, and I quote him in the book. He said, "Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure." So what he's getting at there is, knowing the libertarians are a tiny minority, the only way that they can get power is to use, and he's 3 engineering degrees from MIT, very, very brilliant engineer, understanding that they have to engineer the political process in a different way to achieve their ends. So that is exactly what they are doing. But I think you also caught, Dalia, a really important piece of this, in that they actually think that what they are doing is ethical, right? And so in that sense, too, I think it's, what you say in terms of reverse Marxism, because they have this view of the world that portrays themselves as the makers, the job creators, et cetera, and sees themselves as being besieged by these, grasping hands, as some of their language puts it, or moochers, or Buchanan used the language of parasites, a language that's, kind of frightening, given the ways that it's been used in places like Germany and others in the 20th century. But absolutely, they have that sense that they are the rightful people who should be governing society, that all these other people are interlopers, that their way is the right way. And you can really see that. I mean, they also, like, they don't, to their view, if you can't afford health care, that's on you.
Right. I mean, this raises so many questions. We can't filter them all. But one thing I do want to ask, apropos what you just said, is that in their language, they are advocating for individual rights. And that's a very core element in their thought, except that in your telling, it sounds very much like this whole idea of individual rights is simply, a euphemism for the rights of the very limited, richest people and nobody else's rights. So to what extent is it real? Is it a euphemism? To what extent is the obfuscation part of this? Or is it a coherent political ideology and we have to analyze it as such?
It's both. I mean, I think it is a coherent political ideology, and we cannot understand what is happening in the U.S., but also in country after country, from Brazil to, Britain with Brexit. So many places these ideas are getting traction now. So we have to understand it as a coherent political ideology, but it is also an ideology that is connected to interests, to wealth defense interests, and so therefore does seek to obfuscate the reality, and it does that in a core way. And I actually track this in the book back to John C. Calhoun, that also brilliant Southern slaveholder who wrote several key tracts about government and the U.S. Constitution to protect the minority rights of people like himself. And the way that they do that is to say that the market is the realm of freedom. Any transaction that occurs in the market is between two voluntary actors, right? So they do not treat market power, corporate power, as illegitimate power. They think of it as achieved power. And they say, hey, if Amazon will only hire you at a certain rate, and make you take a little cup, in your Amazon truck when you're delivering because you don't have time to go to the bathroom, well, you voluntarily agreed to that contract. Right? It was voluntary, so there's no coercion there, no coercion in the market. And even, ironically, John C. Calhoun would say there was no coercion in the market as a slaveholder. So that's why I think it's important to keep that lineage in mind.
Nancy, I'd like to ask you a more theoretical question, perhaps, about the ability of big money to influence politics in a fundamental way. Because much of what you say, I hear right-wingers saying about people like George Soros. How do you refrain from painting the Koch brothers and Buchanan and this group as perhaps a mirror image of George Soros and sliding into a big conspiracy theory?
Well, I don't think it's conspiracy theory at all, but I think we are handicapped in that the social sciences do not have a concept to explain what is happening to our society. The amount of strategic thought and huge capacity to invest in that thought and invest in operations to move this agenda. So it's not a conspiracy because the people who are doing this, like Charles Koch, have the capacity to hire the best legal talent to stay within the bounds of the law. George Soros is a figure that the Koch network people and Fox News and the political right in the U.S. always point to say, well, how can you say there's anything wrong with what Charles Koch is doing? Because look, George Soros is funding people on the, in the mainstream and the political left. And I think that is another example of obfuscation, and also one that plays on anti-Semitism. It certainly has, the way that they've deployed it in Central Europe against George Soros. But there couldn't be a greater difference between the philanthropy of Charles Koch and George Soros, because George Soros, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know, came from a family that was devastated devastated by the Holocaust and came to the U.S. and has funded, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe and elsewhere, but funded efforts to ensure transparency, to protect democracy, to promote education, to empower people to break through these rigged political systems, whereas Charles Koch, in contrast, has used his money to rig those political systems, to use the money to agitate, to fund organizations that weaponize racism, that weaponize prejudice in order to move what is ultimately a kind of wealth defense operation. And I think another way to think about this too is, where does that interest come from on the part of Charles Koch? Partly it's ideology, but that ideology is also deeply entwined with the basis of his wealth and Koch Industries in the fossil fuel sector. So Charles Koch has been funding deception, disinformation, climate science denial, attacks on scientists for decades now, at least since 1991. And that bad faith, if you will, is critical to what we're seeing elsewhere. In the 1980s, as he was organizing corporate actors to engage more in the political process, he and his colleagues created a group called Citizens for a Sound Economy. And one of the first things they did is work with embattled tobacco companies to blow smog into the public conversation about the harms of tobacco and to defend those tobacco corporations, to bring them into this political project by showing them what could be done through an apparatus like this that would defend their industry from the threats coming from democracy and public health figures operating through democracy.
Otherwise known as a public health service.
Nancy, maybe one last question because we are running out of time. I'd like to go back to your work on Buchanan and ask you, why do you think he was left unknown in the public and maybe the scholarly debate as well in America? You write how you had to go to his old university and sift through his untended archives. That you opened this conversation by saying that many of our listeners probably never heard of him. Why do you think that is, if he was so influential?
He was not interested in influencing ordinary people. He really wasn't. And he actually would test people that he was taking in as graduate students or training, in these enterprises, and ask them, and I forget exactly how he put the question, but like, would you like to be kind of a celebrity in your own lifetime? Or, would you like to do this? Would you like to do that? Or would you like to have your impact be felt, generations from now? And the right answer was generations from now. So he was perfectly content to operate, in the shadows, but to make, to be connected with all of these different operations on the political right, with the knowledge that his impact would be felt whether or not he personally was recognized for that impact. But I will say, I'm now not the only one, focusing on this impact. So there are other scholars of, what is broadly called neoliberalism who are now writing about Buchanan and his impact, seeing it, in many, many different domains. So I think he will become better known. And also because he did win the Nobel Prize, ironically, he is very much lifted up by George Mason University, his last institutional home, whose largest donor is Charles Koch. And essentially the law school in that university, it's renamed the Scalia School of Law after the arch-right Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. There's something called the Mercatus Center, the Atlas Network. All of these things are operating in the orbit of George Mason University, Buchanan's last home. So they actually do now fundraise in his name for these programs. And so they're contributing to his greater recognition. But he himself, the ultimate reason why he's less known than, say, Friedman is he didn't really care about that. He wanted to have an impact on the shape of power. He wanted to produce constitutional revolutions. He wanted to do things that you would only do with, as another Koch project puts it, highly leveraged actors in countries around the world. So publicity was not his thing.
This is fascinating. And I just want to point out that one reviewer of your book, I believe it was George Monbiot in The Guardian, wrote that Nobel Prize was among the incidents that helped to discredit the Nobel Prize. So there's long-term impact and there's other kinds of long-term impact.
I have a nice fat footnote in the book about the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, because as I was working on this and, people were reading my draft chapters, everybody was, saying, well, how could they give a figure like this the Nobel Prize? Well, lo and behold, the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences is different from the other Nobel Prizes. They use the name, but, the Nobel Prize for Peace, the Nobel Prize for Literature were actually created and endowed by Alfred Nobel. The Economics Prize was created by a Swedish bank, and has long had this kind of right-wing kind of backing and input. So they recognize other figures, people like Paul Krugman, but in general, there has been a bias toward the right in those Nobel Prizes in economic sciences, and they're not associated with Alfred Nobel. So that little mystery is unpacked.
Fascinating footnote. We have lots more we could talk about, but we'll have to stop there. That's Nancy MacLean. We've been discussing her 2017 book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a real pleasure talking with you. Thanks for the wonderful questions.
And thank you to Itai Shelem, manager of TLV1 Studios, and to our producer, Ariel Cohen, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their partnership and support for this series. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review, telling us what you really think. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 600 interviews. Please like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.